The wind came hard across the plains that morning, dragging a trail of dust behind a lone army truck as it crawled along the dirt road. Inside, the men sat in silence, packed shoulder to shoulder on rough wooden benches. They didn't speak. They simply listened to the groan of the engine, the clatter of loose chains, and the steady beat of 1,000 miles already behind them. They were soldiers once. Now they were prisoners, men of the Afrika Korps, veterans of Rommel's desert army, carried across oceans, stripped of their uniforms, and sent deep into the American heartland to do the work of farmers. The truck passed under the open, Nebraska sky, and the men squinted through the slats in the truck bed. What they saw made them hesitate. It wasn't barren or broken as they had imagined. It was alive, green fields rolling endlessly, red barns standing proud, the smell of cut hay hanging in the air, and then they noticed something stranger still. The names painted on the mailboxes: Schmidt, Bauer, Müller, German names. For a long moment, no one breathed. The irony was unbearable. They had crossed oceans, fought and bled for the Reich, and now they rode through a land that looked uncannily like home, tended by people who carried their own language in their names. Somewhere along the fence line, a family stood watching the truck go by, a father in dusty overalls, a woman shading her eyes, a small boy clutching a baseball glove. The boy waved. He didn't know these men were prisoners, maybe he didn't care. He saw only faces, tired, sunburnt, human. Inside the truck, one of the Germans raised his hand just slightly before dropping it again under the eyes of the guards. That simple motion lingered in the air like smoke. It wasn't rebellion or mercy, just life flickering through the cracks of war. The men looked away, but the silence changed. It was no longer the silence of defeat. It was the silence of recognition. For the first time since capture, they were seeing the enemy. And the enemy looked familiar. The road curved, dust followed. The land around them stretched flat and endless, but within the truck every man was somewhere else, back in the memory of his own soil. One thought of his father's small farm near Stuttgart, another of sugar beet rows in Württemberg, another of the church bell that used to call him home on Sunday mornings. It was impossible not to compare. In their minds, the two landscapes began to merge, the farms of Germany and the farms of Nebraska. And in that merging, the first cracks began to appear. Cracks in certainty, cracks in loyalty, cracks in the very idea of who the enemy was supposed to be. When the truck finally slowed, the men leaned forward. Ahead rose a white grain silo, its paint catching the afternoon sun. Across its side, in bold black letters, was a name that could have stood on any German street corner: Keller and Sons Grain Co. The realization hit harder than any artillery shell. They were about to work for people who could have been their neighbors, maybe even their relatives. The brakes squealed. The truck stopped. Dust swirled in thick clouds as the guards barked orders. One by one, the prisoners climbed down into the open air. The ground beneath them was soft and black, richer than most of them had ever seen. They looked around in silence. Chickens scratched near the barn. A tractor groaned in the distance. A dog barked once and fell quiet again. No one said a word, but they all felt it, that strange, disorienting mix of humiliation and awe. The war had carried them across continents, but here they stood on soil that could have been their own. The Daikis guards called them to line up. The sun pressed hard on their backs. In the stillness between orders, the wind whispered through the cornfields like the voice of home. They had thought captivity would be the end of their war. But the real battle, the quiet, invisible one, was only beginning. It would not be fought with rifles or tanks or uniforms. It would be fought in the mind, in the uneasy space between guilt and understanding, between the world they left behind and the one they were now forced to see. That truck, rattling through the Nebraska dust, carried more than prisoners. It carried men who were about to confront the most dangerous enemy they had ever known, themselves. And as the engine shut off and the echoes faded, the plains fell silent again. Only the wind moved, bending the corn, whispering over the land that bore their names. The gates of Fort Robinson stood like a pair of iron jaws, still cold and waiting. Beyond them stretched the rows of long wooden barracks, fenced in with barbed wire that glinted under the Nebraska sun. The place smelled of sawdust and soap, and beneath that faintly of fear. For the Americans it was a camp of order, a machine built to hold men without breaking them. For the Germans it was purgatory, neither home nor hell, but something in between. Each morning began the same. Way, the clang of a bell, the echo of boots on gravel, the voice of a sergeant calling roll. Names were shouted, numbers checked, and the long line of prisoners filed out into the open yard. They had been trained all their lives to follow orders, and now, stripped of everything else, obedience was the only thing left that still made sense. Guards watched from the towers, rifles slung across their chests, eyes hidden behind the glare of the sun. To them, this was just another assignment. They weren't heroes here. They were caretakers of enemies. But among the barbed wire and the fences, something unexpected took root. Routine. The men ate, they cleaned, they repaired, they sang. And with every day that passed, the rhythm of captivity began to resemble a strange version of normal life. In the evening, songs rose from the barracks, low, steady, and sorrowful. Old folk tunes from the Rhine, marching songs from the desert, and sometimes hymns. Their voices carried across the plains like smoke, fading into the night air. To the American guards, it was an eerie sound, a reminder that these weren't monsters, but men with memories, languages, and lives waiting thousands of miles away. One of the guards, barely 20, once said to another as they stood outside the wire, "It's strange. They sound like us when they sing." The other didn't answer. He just nodded and turned his eyes toward the stars. Inside the barracks, the Germans filled the silence with work. Some carved small figures out of scrap wood. Others wrote letters home that would be read and censored before ever leaving the camp. But even the censor couldn't erase the ache between the lines. They wrote about weather, food, and daily chores, and anything safe. But what they were really saying was, "We are alive. Don't forget us." And still, the war went on without them. They could feel it in the newspapers, in the way the guards tightened, their tone when new reports came in. They knew the Allies were pushing deeper into Europe. They knew that something was ending, perhaps the world they had fought for. The camp was divided not by fences, but by belief. Some still held tight to the Reich, clinging to loyalty like a life raft. They marched in line, kept their hair neat, spoke only when spoken to. For them, surrender was a wound that had to be hidden, not healed. Others had already begun to drift away from that faith. They were tired, hollowed out by too many years of fighting. They no longer saw glory in obedience, only exhaustion. Every night, quiet arguments rippled through the barracks, voices lowered, glances sharp. One side whispered of honor and revenge, the other of home, bread, and peace. It was a war inside, a war, and no one knew how to win it. The Americans watched all this with uneasy curiosity. They had expected hatred, maybe violence, but not civility. The Geneva Convention demanded fair treatment, and Fort Robinson obeyed. The prisoners were fed, not well, but better than many civilians back home. They received mail, though they could not write freely. They could move within the wire, but the world beyond remained forbidden, shimmering like a mirage just out of reach. One young lieutenant, new to the camp, wrote in his report, "They seem almost grateful. It's disarming. These men fought us, and now they thank us for rations and routine." But gratitude was only half the truth. Beneath the surface, tension hummed. The Germans knew that kindness was not friendship. It was control, subtle, disciplined, and absolute. They were fed but not free. They were treated humanely but never trusted. And every evening as the gates clanged shut, they were reminded that mercy still wore a uniform. Sometimes the camp grew eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that settles just before a storm, not of weather but of conscience. It was in that quiet that the prisoners began to think. They thought of the faces of farmers they worked for, of the children waving from fence lines, of the mailboxes with familiar names. They began to ask themselves questions they had never dared to before. If the enemy looked like them, worked like them, sang the same hymns as them, then who exactly had they been fighting? But they didn't speak such questions aloud. Not yet. For every man who wondered, there was another who watched. And loyalty, even in captivity, had its enforcers. Vogel, the corporal with the scar, kept his barrack in line with silence sharper than any blade. To him, the Americans were not men but symbols, proof that Germany had faltered, proof that weakness was spreading even here. He reminded the others daily, "We may be prisoners, but we are still soldiers of the Reich." No one challenged him directly, but in the glances exchanged at night, in the quiet sighs after lights out, the resistance had already begun, not against their captors, but against the ghosts of what they once believed. Spring turned to summer. The fields outside ripened with corn and wheat, and the prisoners began to leave the camp each morning under guard, heading toward the neighboring farms. It was simple work, hoeing, hauling, mending fences, but it carried a strange power. With each day in the open air, each hour spent watching the easy rhythm of American life, something inside them shifted. They had come from a world built on destruction. Here everything was built on growth, and that contrast was almost unbearable. By the time the trucks returned in the evenings, the men were exhausted, not only from labor, but from thought. They would sit in silence on the ride back, staring out through the dust, each one wondering whether he was looking at the future or the past. At night, as they lay in their bunks, the same wind that moved the American corn whispered through the camp's open windows. It carried the smell of earth, of crops, of life continuing without them, and in that smell was both comfort and torment. Comfort because it reminded them of home. Torment because it reminded them that home might never be the same again. Fort Robinson was a cage, yes, but it was also a mirror. Inside its wire, men learned that captivity could be gentler than freedom, and that enemies could look unsettlingly familiar. Some would cling to pride, others would begin to let go, but all of them sooner or later would discover that the war they thought had ended was only changing shape. It was no longer fought with bullets and bombs, but with memory, guilt, and the haunting realization that humanity can survive even within the fences built to contain it. The first time they stepped into the open fields, it didn't feel real. The air was too clean, the sky too wide, the silence too forgiving. The guards gave quick instructions, simple gestures, half words, and then stood back to watch. For essay. The prisoners, the ground beneath their boots was foreign, yet heartbreakingly familiar. The soil was black and soft, the kind that could hold roots deep. Back home in the bombed villages of Germany, that same earth was now pocked with craters and ash. Here, it was alive. Hans, the baker's son, bent down instinctively, scooped a handful of soil and let it crumble through his fingers. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The earth itself told the story. This was land untouched by war. For a long moment, the men just stood there, silent figures against the horizon, before picking up their tools and beginning the day's work. They had expected cruelty. Instead, they found rhythm, hoe the weeds, thin the rows, stack the bales. The work was hard but honest, the kind that left the muscles aching and the mind strangely clear. Under the sun, sweat traced the same lines it had in Africa, down cheeks and necks and collarbones. But here the heat didn't carry the scent of oil and gunpowder. It carried the smell of grain, of manure, of life that continued. The guards watched from the shade. They didn't bark orders unless they had to. Most were farmers' sons themselves, drafted too late to fight overseas. To them, these Germans were labor, not comrades, not enemies, just men keeping the crops alive, while their own brothers fought across the ocean. At noon, cardboard boxes arrived from a local contractor. Lunch. When the prisoners opened them, the world seemed to tilt. Inside were sandwiches thick with meat, slices of apple and cartons of milk, food richer than anything they'd seen in years. They ate in silence, half in disbelief. For men who had chewed dry rations in the desert, the taste of fresh bread was almost too much to bear. One of them murmured, half to himself, "This isn't war food," no one replied, but every man there understood what he meant. Around them the fields stretched in every direction, endless, ordered and abundant. Each row of corn felt like a sentence written by a steady hand. Each turn of the tractor, a quiet declaration that the world could survive even when nations tried to destroy it. The red barns glowed under the sun, their names painted in bold black letters: Keller, Schmidt, Bauer. It was impossible to ignore. The names were their own, echoed across oceans and generations. At first they tried not to look, but curiosity gnawed at them. Who were these people? How had they come to live here, so far from the war, so close to peace? Some of the men told. Themselves it didn't matter. Others couldn't stop thinking about it. One afternoon, while hoeing sugar beets, a sound cut through the steady rhythm of work. Laughter. A small girl stood near the edge of the field, barefoot, her hair tied, in ribbons. She waved shyly, clutching a doll in one hand. The guards tensed, ready to shout her away, but she stayed where she was, smiling, fearless, untouched by the invisible lines adults draw in times of war. And then, one of the prisoners, Dieter, the youngest, lifted his hand and waved back. The gesture was small, but it cracked something open inside him. For the rest of that day, his thoughts didn't leave that child. Her smile haunted him, because she looked so much like his niece back home in Munich. When the sun sank, and the truck came to collect them, Dieter climbed aboard with a heaviness that no labor could cause. As the engine rumbled to life, he stared back at the field where the girl had stood. For the first time since capture, he felt something dangerous. Not defiance, not hatred, something more painful. Recognition. The next day, the mood was different. The work continued, but there was an undercurrent, something that hummed beneath. The surface, like a wire, stretched too tight. A farmer approached from the road, middle-aged, broad-shouldered, his face burned deep by the sun. He stopped by the fence, watching the men work. When he spoke, his accent carried the remnants of another world, German, softened by years in America. He pointed to a name on the roster the contractor carried, Schneider. Then, to himself, meine, Family auch. Saxony taught it was barely a sentence, but it hit like a hammer. The prisoner, Schneider, froze. He wanted to answer, but the words refused to come. He just nodded, unable to look away. The farmer smiled faintly, then turned back to his truck and drove off, dust rising behind him. For the rest of the afternoon, Schneider didn't speak. That night in the barracks, he whispered to the others, "He said his family is from Saxony. My family too." No one laughed. No one dismissed it. They all understood what that meant. The days blurred into one another, and yet something subtle began to grow in that blur, an unspoken understanding, a fragile thread between captor and captive, not friendship, not forgiveness, something quieter, a kind of recognition that neither side could explain. But where there's understanding, there's also fear. Not everyone welcomed it. Some of the farmers watched from a distance, uneasy at the sight of German soldiers in their fields. Their sons were fighting overseas. Their husbands were missing in France, and now the same uniforms, stripped of medals and insignia, were walking their land, touching their crops, drinking their water. The line between compassion and contempt grew thin. One woman, carrying water to the edge of the field, placed the jar down and stepped back quickly, her hands trembling. The prisoners saw. They said nothing, but the shame burned in them like sun on bare skin. They knew that look. Their own wives would have looked at prisoners the same way back home, and still the work went on. Each evening, the truck rolled back through the Nebraska plains, carrying men who were more tired than before, not just in body, but in spirit. They had been soldiers once, certain of their cause. Now they were laborers, uncertain of everything. Each passing day made the questions heavier. Who was the real enemy? Where did belonging end and humanity begin? Back in the camp, the nights stretched long. The men lay awake on their bunks, listening to the distant hum of tractors, the low howl of wind across the fields. Those sounds followed them into sleep, reminders that somewhere beyond the wire, life was moving forward without them, and in that movement there was something cruel and beautiful, because the land that fed their captors now also fed them. And the hands that once carried rifles now carried tools. It was as if the world itself had turned upside down and was trying gently to set itself right again. The fields of Nebraska were not battlefields, yet every day they waged a quieter. Wasikis one fought in silence, in memory, in the simple act of labor. For the men of Fort Robinson, the earth beneath their feet became both punishment and redemption. And as the harvest ripened, so did the truth they had long tried to bury, that enemies could share the same roots, and that peace, like wheat, sometimes grows in the strangest soil. They began to see themselves everywhere. Small things first: a name on a mailbox, a grain company stamped with a surname they knew from childhood, a bent fence post fixed in the same way their fathers had fixed fences. These were ordinary marks of ordinary lives, but to men who had been forged in conflict, they read like a judgment. The Nebraska landscape had become a mirror that reflected not only faces and names, but the choices that had led them here. Inside the barracks, conversations grew quieter and heavier. Where once there had been boasting or bitter jokes, now there were whispered reckonings. A man named Ernst, a former schoolteacher, spent long hours tracing the letters of names on seed sacks, as if the ink would teach him the story of the people who bore them. Hans, who had once risen before dawn to tend an oven, began to hum a tune he had not thought of in years. Not a marching song, but a lullaby. Each note felt like an apology he had never meant to make. The mirror did not flatter. It interrogated. One afternoon, a contractor checked names at the edge of a field with the professionalism of a man stamping timesheets. He pointed at a roster and then at a mailbox, Schneider. He muttered something under his breath in his clipped American-accented German. The prisoner with that name, who had kept his voice small since capture, felt his chest constrict. He remembered a story his mother had told him of a relative who had once left for America. That story had always been bittersweet. Now it was a living thing that walked beside him among the rows of corn. Among the guards, the talk was different. Their conversations were pragmatic, shaded by worry for sons abroad and the pressure that came from home. Yet even they felt the mirror's pull. A young guard, lean and freckled, admitted in private to a buddy that he had shaken hands with one prisoner after work when no one was looking. For him, the handshake had been a reflex of decency. For others, it was a breach. Rumors, like small seeds, found soil in those brittle divides. Suspicion, like a slow disease, crept outward. In town, mothers crossed the street to avoid the trucks. Teenagers spat at passing tires. Letters to local newspapers condemned the practice of feeding enemy soldiers better than Allied troops. Men who had once been neighbors argued loudly in barber shops and grocery aisles. The sight of the POWs bent over beet rows became for some a living insult, proof of an injustice that could not be forgiven. And yet the mirror continued to show them something else as well, the faint outlines of possibility. John Kruger was a farmer who would come to matter in a way that surprised him. He had stiffened the first morning he saw the truck, clenched his jaw until the veins showed at his temple. His nephew lay in a cemetery in Italy, and the anger it birthed was raw. He watched the prisoners work his fields with suspicion. Then, with a kind of weary necessity, the harvest would not pause for grief. One day, while supervising the stacking of hay, he heard a voice carrying across the yard. A prisoner, humming without realizing he was heard, sang the old Lutheran hymn, "A Mighty Fortress." The sound sank into Kruger's chest like water. He stopped. The hymn was the same his mother had sung at home on Sundays. For a breath he felt no hatred, only a sudden recognition. Human beings can be two things at once. Kruger's grief did not vanish overnight, but neither did the sight of a man steadying another's fall. He found himself thinking of the boy he had lost, and how that boy might have grown up to be a neighbor who shared the same hymn. The thought was like a stone dropped into a pond. Its ripples would reach farther than he imagined. Not everyone found their heart softened. There were men who watched every move the prisoners made, waiting for proof of treachery. In the barracks, Vogel stoked that vigil. His scarred face tightened when he saw a farmer reach a hand toward a prisoner to assist him up from a pile of straw. "They get too much," he muttered. "They are pampered here while our families starve." His words landed in the bunk room like blows. Some whispered agreement, others shifted uncomfortably. The camp's internal politics grew tangled. The question that had once seemed theoretical, what did it mean to be enemy, became urgent and personal. Younger men who had known only the taste of orders and the camaraderie of foxholes had to decide whether to keep their mouths shut for survival or to speak up when a neighbor offered a smile. Older men, carrying the weight of children left behind, and mothers who wrote of hunger, found themselves pulled toward a compassion that felt like betrayal to some. Outside the wire, small acts carried the force of sermons. A farmer's wife, who had once refused to bring water near the prisoners, slipped a single apple into a lunchbox when no one watched. A contractor, who had skirted conversation for weeks, found himself asking in broken German whether a man would be all right in the rain. These gestures were shadows, faint and fragile. But shadows accumulate until they become light. Rumors about escape attempts, mostly nonsense at first, began to circulate. A group of boys claimed they had seen two prisoners near the road one evening, peering toward the horizon. The story traveled from mouth to mouth, curdling into accusations and fear. Guards increased patrols. Trucks were searched more carefully. A farmer's wife, who had once shrugged at the sight of the detainees, now chained her barn door every night. In the barracks, Vogel used these rumors as fuel. "Too easy," he hissed one night. "They let us walk. They trust us. Trust is not liberty. It is a chain." Some men listened, not because they believed him, but because fear is sometimes a safer company than doubt. Dieter, the youngest, found himself torn. The idea of escape tempted him less than the idea of what would happen if escape failed, what reprisals might rain down on those who had shown him kindness. He could not reconcile loyalty to a broken cause with the memory of a little girl's smile. The war beyond the wire stamped in new headlines. Normandy, the push toward Paris. Each scrap of news was a barometer for hope and dread. When word came of Allied successes, a murmur rippled through the camp. For some, it meant the end of an era they had believed in. For others, it aroused anger, a final clutching at a flag that was already tattered. One evening, a telegram arrived at Kruger's farmhouse. He read it with a hand that trembled, his jaw clenched. The nephew who had been serving in Italy was listed as killed. The grief that had been a simmering burn flared into something unbearable. Kruger watched men not as faces, but as being, and the sight filled him with a rage that had a clear target. That night, he walked through his fields with an ache in his chest, and when a prisoner stumbled and another helped him up, the sight did not bring peace. It brought guilt so sharp it felt like betrayal. The mirror does not forgive easily. It shows both the glory and the rot. It forces choices. In the barracks, the men argued until late into the night, under the low buzz of a single bulb. Vogel ranted about honor and shame. Ernst, quietly weary, suggested that survival required cooperation, not blind pride. Dieter listened, feeling the ground shift underfoot. The conversation ended with no resolution, only the understanding that whatever they chose would shape them for the remainder of their lives. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, an omen none of them could name. Rain would come. Fields would turn to mud. Harvests depended on weather, and weather, like fate, was indifferent. For now, the mirror held them suspended between two worlds, one of memory and loyalty, the other of daily tasks and the small mercies of people who, for reasons of their own survival or compassion, reached out a hand. And as the sun sank low across the plains, the men of Fort Robinson felt the weight of a question that would not be answered by orders or by force. If enemies share the same names, the same hymns, and the same soil, what becomes of enmity itself? The answer for the time being waited in the distance, in storms that were coming, in letters that would arrive, and in choices that had to be made before the next dawn. Storms arrive like truth, unavoidable, loud, and cleansing. The weather baked the plains all week, a heavy heat that made the corn droop and the men's shirts cling to their backs. Then, without much warning, the sky turned sour. Clouds piled, low, black, and angry, like a fist pressed against the horizon. The air smelled of rain and something older, the metallic scent that reminds men of battle and of waiting. On the morning the storm came, the prisoners went to the fields as usual. The work moved with the same mechanical efficiency. Hoes swung, bales were stacked, and the tractors kept a steady, indifferent rhythm. But the sky kept watching them, growing darker by the hour. A distant rumble rolled across the plain, like An old gun awakened. There is a small particular anxiety that arrives when weather turns. It is not simply the fear of getting wet. It is the sense that plans may be interrupted and that the world may reshuffle the priorities that men hold so tightly. For the prisoners, who lived by schedules and orders, the storm was a question asked in a language they still had to translate. Around noon, as the first heavy drops began to fall, a rumor moved faster than the wind. 2 prisoners had been seen near the road the previous night, peering toward the county line. By the time the rain turned into a steady pour, the rumor had transformed into a charge. Men in town spoke of possible escape. Guards tightened their belts and their faces. The contractor's clipboard, normally an unremarkable thing, became a talisman of accountability, checked and rechecked. Trucks were inspected, pockets searched, boots tapped for secreted items. Even the farmers who had shown small kindnesses found themselves double-checking latches and counting implements that had gone missing before a rain. Everyone acted as if a single misstep could tip the scales from uneasy civility to violence. And yet, amid the tightening, the storm did what storms do best. It made small truths obvious. Rain does not ask whether you are enemy or friend. It taps you with the same indifferent hand. So when a sudden squall rose and sheets of water began to lash the rows of corn, hands that had been quick to point began to move toward one another. It happened slowly. A young guard noticed a prisoner hobble, his ankle twisted from an earlier misstep. Without thinking, the guard removed his oilcloth coat and held it over the man's head as they moved him toward the shade of a nearby barn. The movement was practical, not poetic, a sheltering of one human by another. A farmer who had tightened his jaw around suspicion minutes earlier helped secure a loose tarp to keep hay from soaking. A woman who had crossed the road now slipped an extra sandwich into a lunchbox when no one watched. But with kindness came complication. The rumor of escape, fueled by fear and drenched in imagination, did not vanish with the rain. If anything, it changed shape. That evening, under the low electric sky, a group of boys claimed to have seen 2 prisoners by the road, attempting to talk to a passing truck. The story, soaked and exaggerated, found an audience hungry for drama. Men who had been on the fence about the POWs' presence leaned toward conviction. Guards sharpened their patrols. The company of soldiers inside the camp tightened like a fist. Inside the barracks, the atmosphere turned taut. Vogel, the man who treated bitterness like doctrine, saw the rumor as vindication. He prowled the bunks, voice low, stirring anger like embers. "See," he said, "they look for a way out. We cannot be soft." His words found fertile ground among those who had lost sons and brothers and who could not forgive what they imagined. Yet even as Vogel spoke, others felt the opposite force. The fear that reprisals would destroy the fragile goodwill that had grown between some farmers and certain prisoners. Dieter, who had waved to the child weeks earlier and who now feared consequences beyond his imagining, sat awake and thought of the little girl's face as rain hammered the roof above him. Suspicion has a way of testing loyalty, and loyalty tests often demand sacrifice. When the camp commandant received a terse report of the rumor, he acted with the precise mixture of caution and pragmatism expected of men charged with maintaining order. He ordered night watches bolstered and trucks to be guarded more closely. But there is a danger in too much vigilance. It becomes a crucible that can forge real transgressions from nothing. Men become claustrophobic beneath it. Some grow desperate. The prison of watchfulness can, in the end, create the very flight it fears. Late that night, as thunder rolled and lightning cracked the sky in white-hot seams, an incident occurred that would change the tenor of the camp. 2 prisoners, not the most hardened or the most timid, but 2 who had been new to the harvest detail, were seen moving toward the field edge. Whether they intended to run or only to walk and watch is a question that never had a single answer. In the wet dark, a farmer driving back from a neighbor's noticed them and assumed the worst. He raised an alarm. Guards reacted with speed taught by training and fear. Trucks roared to life, lights cut through the rain, and men shouted. The prisoners, tangled in wet clothes and mud, were corralled back into the glare. For a breath, the night crackled with possibility. The possibility of violence, of escape, of punishment. Then the truth collapsed into a smaller, less dramatic thing. The two men had been trying to find a fallen hat and had wandered too close to the road. They were hauled back, shook, and locked in temporary isolation. Even so, the episode left a bruise. Beds were searched that night, not for contraband alone, but for traces of audacity. Men who had tasted small kindnesses found themselves being eyed with suspicion anew. Farmers, stunned and resentful at what they imagined could have happened, tightened their locks. The rumor that had been a small spark now smoked. Fear had found shelter again, and yet something else had shifted as well. The guard who had thrown his coat over the twisted ankle that afternoon could not forget the way the man's eyes registered that small mercy. He had expected fear, perhaps even hatred. Instead, he had found gratitude so raw and immediate that it unsettled him. That simple exchange wounded his certainty. Perhaps enemies were not as simple as banners and bulletins suggested. The commandant, who had to balance justice with policy, convened a measured council the following morning. The verdict was clear: no mass escapes, no collective reprisals, and a reinforcement of rules. But within the ruling room in private, men admitted their unease. The line between safety and humanity was thinning. For the prisoners, the near escape, such as it had been, became a lesson. Vogel slammed his fist on a bunk and argued that only the bold would be remembered. The younger men, shaken by the thunder and the shouts, felt differently. Dieter, who had considered the horizon in more than one way, realized that escape was not a plan, but a moral problem, one that would harm those who had shown them kindness. He did not know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew he would not cross that road. Outside the wire, conversation remained split. Some townsfolk called for stricter measures. Others, chastened by the image of frightened men chased in the rain, pressed for caution before judgment. The farmers who had offered small mercies felt the weight of community backlash. One who had held his tongue for weeks finally addressed a neighbor who had shouted in the general store. He spoke not of politics, but of work done well, of hands calloused by labor, and of the harvest that waited. It was not an argument that erased fear, but it was a start. Storms have a way of clearing the air, even as they expose the land to erosion. In the days that followed, the rain made the fields richer and the dust settle into the furrows. But the memory of the night, of trucks cutting through lightning, of men shouting in the rain, did not wash away. It settled like a film over the camp, a reminder that caution could curdle into cruelty if not tempered by restraint. That restraint, fragile as it was, became the camp's quiet hope. It lived in small acts: a farmer slipping an extra slice of bread into a lunchbox, a guard pausing before speaking, a prisoner returning a found tool rather than pocketing it. These were not grand gestures. They were instead the stitches in a fragile seam holding a fragile piece together. And when the storm finally moved on, leaving the sky washed and the fields glinting with water, the men walked into a changed world. The mud clung to their boots, but the air felt clearer. The rumor of escape had been answered not by mass arrests or cruelty, but by a renewed attention to balance. The balance between fear and mercy, between security and humanity. The rain had shown them this, that in times of trial, small mercies do more to shape the future than grand pronouncements. The real test, the storm had taught them, would not come from gods or headlines, but from choices made at the level of a handshake, a coat, or a sandwich left where no one was watching. News travels in curious ways inside a camp. It comes folded in censored letters, scratched across the margins of torn newspapers, whispered under the hum of a single bare bulb. For months, the headlines had seemed distant and mechanical, movements. On a map, gains and losses announced with terse gravity. Then, as the seasons turned, the rhythm of war began to change and the headlines became something that touched the skin. The day the first rumor of surrender threaded its way through Fort Robinson, men gathered in small knots, faces turned towards whoever claimed to carry the tidings. Some believed at once, clinging to the hope that surrender might mean a quicker return home, or at least an end to the uncertainty that had become a constant companion. Others, hardened by a lifetime of orders and denials, suspected a trick, yet even the skeptics felt the air shift. It was the same movement that comes at the edge of winter, a subtle tilting of the light, a hush before a thaw. When the official word came that Germany had capitulated, that the Führer was dead, that the maps of Europe were being redrawn, the camp reacted as nations always react to the end of great storms, with a mixture of relief, grief, and bewilderment. For some prisoners, the news was a wound opened anew. The life they had left behind had been altered irreparably. Cities, they remembered as whole, stood now as rubble and ruin in the reports. Letters that had once promised parcels and better days now arrived thin and infrequent. To imagine returning was to imagine stepping into a landscape of absence. In the mess hall, men sat with newspapers tremulous in their hands. Some wept quietly, not from relief, but from a sustained sorrow that had nowhere else to go. Others laughed. In short, brittle bursts that had more to do with shock than mirth. The guards, their duty complete in one sense, watched with hard faces softened here and there by a human flicker. They had been charged with containing enemies. Now they were charged with arranging departures. The shift in responsibility did not erase the long hours spent watching, nor the complex, awkward bonds that had formed. Orders came down with the cold precision of bureaucracy. Men were to be processed, manifests checked, dates set. Ships would come to carry them across the ocean the same way they had been brought here, crammed into holds, bearing people between worlds. The difference now was intention. One voyage had been toward captivity, the other was a return toward an uncertain home. For the farmers, the news was a different kind of rupture. Bells rang in small towns. Church congregations spilled into streets, with prayers on their lips. There were parties in some places, an Englishman might call it a village-level cessation of hostilities, and tears in others. But woven through celebration was a quiet anxiety. What would become of the men who had so recently labored in their fields? Could a handshake endure when the reasons for it were rooted in temporary necessity? Would letters sent across the ocean find willing hands back in Germany? And would the memory of a man who had once been a prisoner persist as a neighbor, or simply a story told over fences and kitchen tables? Goodbyes are never simple. They are knotty with obligation and regret. The departure from Fort Robinson followed this pattern. There were formal parades of paperwork, the slow clatter of trunks, and the exchange of a few words that tried to hold meaning yet often failed. Men who had shared bunk spaces and broken bread now read lists of names and prepared for the trip back. Some of those names would never again belong to the same maps they had once known. The farmers who had come to rely on POW labor found themselves adjusting. Some bowed their heads, feeling relief and a strange loneliness at once. Others felt only relief. Yet a number of them, not many but enough to matter, stood by the roadside when the trucks rolled away, hats in hands, eyes fixed on the diminishing figures. A few stepped down, approaching the fences despite the rules that had been rigid for months. In quiet corners, they pressed scraps of sewing or a note into a prisoner's hands, asking for a letter when the men reached home. These small requests were offered in defiance of regulations and, in some cases, in defiance of neighbors who would later mock them for what they called softness. When the ships arrived at the ports months later, the scenes were both triumphant and heart-wrenching. Men who had fought under flags now waited under no flag at all, just a stub of paper and a ticket that would bear them home. The journey back was the reverse of their arrival. Where once they had come toward captivity with fear or resignation, now they went toward an uncertain welcome. Some were greeted at home by families who had survived the bombing and hunger and who received them with open arms despite the chaos. Others returned to empty houses or rubble-strewn streets where nothing looked as it had before. There were stories that threaded across the ocean, letters that carried the weight of weather and time. Some prisoners wrote to the farmers who had fed them, offering thanks for small mercies. A few farmers responded. Fewer still opened their homes to welcome a man back in later years, sponsoring him to settle in a country that had once been the enemy. Those rare stories of migration, of a man who once held a rifle now holding a baby in Nebraska, became the stuff of private legend. They spoke to the oddity of human life, that a brief, enforced intimacy under watchful eyes could turn into a lifelong tether. But not all returns were joyous. For many, the Germany that awaited was a place of ruin, moral collapse, and the heavy blankness of guilt. Veterans who had fought were judged in streets they no longer recognized. Some found that neighbors had been killed, homes destroyed, and fortunes lost. Others returned to towns where men whose sons had died in the war could not look them in the eye. The material rebuilding would take years. The rebuilding of trust, that most fragile architecture, would take generations. Back in Nebraska, the harvests continued. Machines hummed, and life took its practical, stubborn course. Tractors followed plows, barns were emptied and filled, children grew and played. But the memory of those seasons when prisoners had tilled the land did not fade quickly. In kitchens and at tavern tables, the stories were told in low voices. The man who hummed hymns while stacking hay, the boy who waved from a fence and received a returned gesture, the farmer who slipped an apple into a lunchbox. These small accounts persisted because they held an uncomfortable truth, that ordinary people can be humane even when nations are not. The schools of thought that emerged from those years were different and sometimes opposed. Some argued that using POW labor had been a moral blunder, an insult to the families with sons at war. Others maintained that it had been a necessary and pragmatic solution to a labor shortage. But beyond these debates lived the human truth that knitted together those who had worked the fields. The men who remained in America, the ones sponsored by farmers, the ones who eventually made new homes, carried with them the peculiar memory of being once both enemy and neighbor. Their children, born in a country their fathers had once been ordered to oppose, would keep only stories. Those narratives would sometimes be told with pride, sometimes with a kind of embarrassed apology, and sometimes with nothing but a shrug and a quiet, grateful nod. In time, years turned into decades. The small patches of kindness and the odd friendships that had begun under watchful eyes became part of the deeper sediment of memory. Veterans on both sides grew older. The farmers' children took over barns and fields. The prisoners' grandchildren learned names in 2 languages. Letters that had been folded and hidden in trunks found their way into albums and were read aloud at Christmas middays. A picture of a man in a faded uniform stood next to images of grandchildren at baseball games. Time smoothed edges, but did not erase the imprint. And when the men who had once been prisoners returned to the Nebraska plains as elderly visitors, sometimes for reunions or the graves of friends, they walked slowly and with exaggerated care. They traced fingers over the rails of fences they might have thought useless decades earlier, and sometimes they paused, speaking to a farmer who had been a boy when they had worked his land. The conversations were not grand. They were small and careful, like a well-worn tool, measured, practical, and full of shared history. The deepest lesson of those years, if one could be named, was not about politics or strategy. It was about the persisting power of ordinary human acts. A shared hymn, a sandwich left where no one would see it, a hand stretched out in the rain. In a world that had been torn by ideology and bombing, these small mercies endured. They did not erase suffering, they did not repay loss. But they offered a path forward, one person at a time. When historians later wrote the small local chapters of that larger war, they often closed with the same reluctant conclusion, that the war was not only fought on beaches and in cities, but also in fields where men bent their backs and their convictions. That Fort Robinson and places like it were laboratories of a different sort of reconciliation. Imperfect, uneven, and painfully human. The trucks that had once carried prisoners back and forth along rutted Nebraska lanes fell silent in memory. But their echoes remained. The creak of wooden benches, the clatter of tools, the murmur of songs in the night. These sounds persisted as evidence that even in the midst of rupture, the bonds that bind people quietly endure. And so, when the last of the departures were logged and the gates of Fort Robinson closed to the chapter of its wartime roll, the plains returned to their rhythms. Yet the story remained, stitched into the fabric of both countries. It was a story that refused simple endings. Instead, it offered continuity, of men who had once been enemies becoming neighbors in ways they could scarcely have imagined, of gratitude shared awkwardly across an ocean, and of the small human acts that carry the power to outlast the thunder of war. The wind that moves across the Nebraska plains today carries few traces of what happened there. The fences are gone, the barracks torn down, the watchtowers long since surrendered to time. Only the land remains, the same open sky, the same soft soil that once bound strangers together by work, by necessity, by fate. Yet if you listen closely, on a quiet evening you can almost hear them. The hum of a tractor, the rustle of corn, the faint echo of men singing in a language that once marked them as enemies. Voices carried not by anger, but by memory. Not by pride, but by the longing to belong somewhere again. History, when told on grand scales, speaks in numbers, divisions, battalions, casualties, treaties. But the real history of war lives in smaller places, in the spaces between people. It lives in a borrowed tool passed across a fence, in a song hummed without permission, in a hand raised to wave when no one else dared. In those moments, the war slipped, just for a breath, out of the grip of nations and back into the hands of men. Those German prisoners who came to Nebraska never imagined that their greatest battle would be fought not with bullets, but with recognition. They arrived as soldiers of a broken empire, taught to see the world through orders and flags. They left as men who had seen the other side of humanity, the side that works the earth, shares its bread, and offers kindness without expecting it to be returned. And the Americans who watched over them, farmers, guards, sons and daughters, they too were changed. They learned that strength does not always come from victory. Sometimes it comes from restraint, from mercy, from choosing not to hate when hating would have been easier. The story of Fort Robinson is not about battles. It is about endurance, the endurance of decency in indecent times. It reminds us that the boundaries drawn by war can blur in the most unexpected places, that the soil beneath our feet is never neutral. It remembers every footprint, every act of labor, every act of grace. For some, that grace turned into a second life. A few of those prisoners returned years later, not as captives, but as citizens. They married, raised families, tilled the same soil they had once worked under guard. Their children learned English in schools their fathers could never have entered. And their names, Müller, Schmidt, Bauer, found their way back onto Nebraska mailboxes, this time without irony, without fear. For others, the memory of captivity became a lesson passed down quietly. They told their sons and daughters that, even in chains, a man can choose how to see the world. They spoke of farmers who treated them as workers, not as enemies, of guards who shared cigarettes on cold mornings, of the small girl who waved from the fence, the image that for one man never left his mind until the day he died. History often forgets those details. It prefers the thunder to the silence, the victory to the aftermath. But it is in those silences that we find what endures. Because the real victory of any war, if there is one, is not who wins the ground, but who learns to see the humanity of the other side before the guns fall quiet. When we look back now, 80 years later, we are the inheritors of that fragile understanding. The world is still divided, still fearful, still learning. But the echo of the fields reminds us that understanding does not need parades or speeches. It begins in work shared, in respect earned, in mercy given freely. The men who once labored here under the guard of rifles are gone. But the lesson they left is not. It sits in every story told quietly at a dinner table, every faded photograph in an attic, every child who grows up never knowing that the ground beneath them was once the meeting place of enemies. When you stand on that soil, you are standing on the memory of forgiveness. It is not a loud memory. It doesn't demand applause. It simply waits, like the land itself, to remind anyone who will listen that even in the darkest chapters of our history, there is still light. Light in a shared song. Light in a simple meal. Light in a gesture as small as a hand raised in greeting. Because sometimes the most profound victories are not won on battlefields. They are found in the quiet recognition that the enemy you feared is, in the end, not so different from yourself.